The BFM Breakfast Grill, connecting you to top people and ideas. Presented by U Mobile.
This morning on the Breakfast Grill, we have Bruce Gale, author of the book titled Economic Reform in Malaysia, The Contribution of Najibnomics. Good morning, Bruce, and welcome to the Breakfast Grill.
Well, thank you.
Bruce, in your book, you mentioned that you're not the first to coin the term Najibnomics.
That's true, yes.
But you have your own definition.
Yes, I certainly do, yes.
So how do you define Najibnomics?
All right, for the purpose of this book, I decided that Najibnomics really did need a definition, and you can't just say this is a nice, cute term to talk about. So I gave it a definition. To me, Najibnomics is the practice of increasing the resilience of an economy by pressing ahead with macroeconomic and administrative reforms, regardless of their short-term political cost. I like to say that that's something which is characteristic of the current government, particularly Najib, because it's very rare to find a government that's insisting on pressing ahead with unpopular economic policies, despite the fact that they may very well be voted out at the next election. Usually what a government will do is it'll put off such policies or find ways of, well, I don't know what the word would be, dumbing them down or diluting them. Najib doesn't seem to have done that. He's sort of gone full pelt into it.
And so the operative word in the definition being pressing ahead or reforms, what do you place greater emphasis on? The fact that he has those reforms or the fact that he's actually pushing ahead with them? That's
a very good question. I don't know which would be more important. I suppose they both really are important. The reforms were important. Whether another prime minister may have done it, perhaps in a different way, is hard to say. But Najib, I think, has been quite determined about this. I'd have to say both are important.
Because, for example, the GST, that idea had been around even before the Najib administration.
Yeah, definitely.
Right, and so the fact that he actually rolled it out, perhaps that is to his credit then. Is that what you're contending?
And I mean, you can go back to the Mahathir era and they were talking about that. I mean, they had sales taxes in those days. And if you remember, the GST actually replaced the sales tax. The Abdullah administration, they started talking about a GST, and it was really only Najib who implemented it, yes.
So in short, you contend that Najibnomics has been good for Malaysia's economy?
I said overall, yes, because what we have now is a much stronger economy than we had when he first took over. There's a lot of dimensions to that point. We can get onto that later.
Yeah, certainly. Let's talk about the reasons for why you wrote this book on Najibnomics. And was there someone who commissioned this project?
There was no commissioning. Nobody told me write this book or asked me to write this book. It was an idea which started. I don't know how ideas come sometimes. I had, as you will know, I've written other books on Malaysian politics and economics, but they were many years ago. And I thought it was about time I went back and had another look at the Malaysian situation. And when I did, I realized that, Najib was doing something which seemed almost unique, pressing ahead with economic reforms that were clearly unpopular, clearly could result in him losing his job. And so then you ask, well, why was he doing that? I mean, how could he get away with it? I mean, was it important? And I felt that people were not seeing it in its proper context. One of the problems with Malaysia today is when we talk about Malaysian economics, everyone talks about 1MDB, or they talk about Felder Global Ventures. The problem is that people tend to see everything in Malaysia, all economic policies, through that lens. And so everything that they see on Malaysian politics is coloured by that. And while it's true that 1MDB and Felder Global Ventures are important in some respects, if you look at the macroeconomic picture, they're not actually as important as you might think, given the amount of publicity that's been given to it.
But what's inherently wrong about viewing the Najib administration through that lens, that 1MDB or FGV lens? Because if, let's say, we consider the scale of the controversy surrounding 1MDB, it spans many countries, and the figure that is attached to that saga is in the tens of billions, then is it not fair to then view that as a key indicator of where Najib's policies are going?
No, it's not a key indicator at all. I mean, let's look at 1MDB, okay? Now, we know that it was the beginning of last year, I think it was, when the government itself announced that I think 1MDB had something like 50 billion ringgit in liabilities and 53 billion ringgit in assets, which is a sort of serious position for a thing to be. But if we look at the government exposure to 1MDB in terms of what is the government obliged to do, they have guaranteed 5 billion ringgit in loans. That is, that the loan to 1MDB is taken out, the government has pledged to guarantee that it would repay them if 1MDB couldn't. That's 5 billion. But if you look at the total number of loans which the government has guaranteed to various private sector corporations, government-linked, we're talking 177 billion compared to 5 billion 1MDB. It's a very small proportion. If you want to talk about how serious that 177 billion is, then perhaps we shouldn't be talking about 1MDB at all because it's very small. We should be talking about the government's National Education Loan Scheme. And there we're talking about a guaranteed loans of, say, something in the region of 30 or 35 billion. And that organisation is having problems. They are, we know, because students are simply not repaying their loans. All right? That is a serious problem. And if just looking at the scale of it, that's much more serious than 1MDB. But 1MDB gets the publicity, right? And it gets the publicity perhaps for political reasons.
Well, political reasons and also the fact that there are allegations of corruption on a mass scale. And again, you've got some pretty damning statements that are being made, for example, from the U.S. Department of Justice, right? So, I mean, if you were to compare it, say, with the PTPTN, that's the National Higher Education Loan System that you spoke about, at least you've got Malaysians who are benefiting from it, i.e. getting an education. Whereas with 1MDB, it doesn't really filter down to, at least for the average Malaysian, right? At least that's the perception out there. Well, so is that a fair juxtaposition?
I mean, okay, I can accept that point. I mean, that's fine. I mean, I'm writing a book, though, about the macroeconomic situation in Malaysia. I'm not writing a book about corruption in Malaysia, although that's certainly a factor. But if it's not a factor that's so serious as to create a massive macroeconomic crisis.
And certainly in the preface of your book, you made that distinction between the Prime Minister's macroeconomic policies and politics. So why was this distinction necessary and how do you actually separate the two?
Well, it's difficult to separate the two because in the ordinary Malaysian doesn't, right? And I'm saying that, you know, if you really want to understand the Malaysian economy today, you have to try to make the effort. Because if you look at everything through the lens of 1MDB, you'll say this country is in a serious mess. It's, you know, on its last legs, that, you know, the country is facing a crisis. But the reality is quite the reverse. This country is, its GDP, annual GDP growth, is far ahead of the global average. All right? We talk about, you hear a lot of people talk about inflation. Inflation under Najib, average inflation was around 2.5%, which is lower than average inflation for the previous 45 years in Malaysia. My problem is that people don't see these issues in their historical context. And we could discuss, why is that true? Why is it that people believe that the country is facing some sort of crisis? I mean, that is in itself is an interesting question.
Or perhaps a disconnect. So I'll take you up on that then. So why do you think there is this disconnect between the virtues of this macroeconomic policies, Najibnomics, versus the sentiment on the ground?
Well, I think one important reason is the way Malaysian politics has changed since 2008. I mean, since 2008, we saw there's quite a watershed election, the government losing its two-thirds majority for the first time since 1969. And so we have a strong opposition in Parliament, all right? This is an opposition which can then begin to highlight weaknesses And by the way, the 1MDB is not the only weakness in the economy. We can discuss that later as well, because I certainly wouldn't be saying that, the Malaysian economy is anyways perfect. I'm just saying it's getting better. So you have a strong opposition, all right, who's capable of bringing these things up, so people hear it. And second thing is that we have the internet now, and social media. We have online newspapers who can bring these things up. So not only do you have a strong opposition, you have a means by which this opposition can make its voice heard.
And presumably that has actually spilled over into criticisms aimed at your book. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I suppose so. One can argue that Malaysia is more democratic now than it has been almost since independence.
Coming up in just a bit, we'll dive deeper into the contents of your book and perhaps speak about the merits of Najibnomics. I'm speaking to Bruce Gale, author of Economic Reform in Malaysia, The Contribution of Najibnomics.
You are listening to the BFM Breakfast Grill, brought to you by U-Mobile.
Thanks for staying with us. I'm Tan Chung Han, and with me in the studio is Bruce Gale, author of Economic Reform in Malaysia, The Contribution of Najibnomics. Now, Bruce, in the first half, you spoke about how, through your lens, you see the Malaysian economy becoming better. What are the points or what are the arguments that support such a notion?
Well, you simply just have to look at the facts. People talk about the fiscal deficit. But when you talk about fiscal deficit, we need to talk about that as a proportion of GDP, because that's the only time that really makes sense rather than the absolute number. If you do that, then in 2009, the fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP was 6.7%. In 2016, that had dropped to 3.1%. Right? If we just look at international trade, we can see that while exports actually have been improving and we still have a positive balance of trade, right? Nevertheless, the economy as a whole is less dependent on international trade than it was when he took over. Much less dependent, which means that any downturn in international trade will have less impact now on the Malaysian economy than it would have had, say, 10 years ago.
But what good are these macro numbers, again, if it doesn't trickle down to the average Malaysian? Because you speak about inflation, for example. We had inflation peaking at above 5% in March of this year, the rising cost of living. And these are serious issues that Malaysians have to contend with on a daily basis. So what good are double-digit exports? What good is, 4.5%, 5% GDP growth if the average Malaysian does not benefit?
I think they will benefit eventually. You talk about this 5.7%, growth. That's not a year-on-year phenomenon. Year-on-year, it's a lot better than that. Also, I want to make the point that we talk a lot about GST when we talk about cost of living, and GST is blamed for this inflation, particularly when we talk about the poorer segments of the community, and they say they're the ones who are paying. But if you look more closely, you'll find that actually there are a lot of things which are simply not subject to GST. There's no GST on rice or fresh fruit or meat and vegetables. There's no GST on flour, sugar, coffee, tea, baby formula, all types of books, and all the medicines listed on the National Essential Medicines list. There's no GST on telecom roaming services. There's no GST on online newspapers.
At least yet.
Well, you can say that. But if the prices of those things have gone up, and I wouldn't deny that they haven't gone up because of the actions of the government in introducing GST. Okay.
Now, on this show, we have heard aplenty the merits of GST, and we get it, but often the concerns stem from how the GST collections, how that will be used. And this brings us back to, the 1MDB FGV lens, because if these initiatives under the Najib administration, 1MDB in particular, if they can happen, right, what more, other instances of corruption or wastage when it comes to Najib's policies? Essentially, what's to say that Najib's macroeconomic policies are free of similar risks, given the mismanagement that we see with 1MDB, with FGV, etc.?
Yeah, look, we've seen mismanagement in Malaysian society that goes back decades. Okay.
So in that sense,
there's nothing.
There's
nothing new about that. I mean, it's just that it's getting a lot more publicity now, and I've no objection to that. I mean, of course, we should be looking at and discussing these weaknesses. Look, you can go back if you want. We can talk about these problems and the corruption under the Mahathir administration, but we can go back before that. Do you know, in 1957, just before independence, Tunku Abdul Rahman had a problem with his MPs because he introduced to them a deficit budget, and several government MPs threatened to vote against it and bring the government down. And he had to turn around and say, if you do that, I will resign. He cracked the whip, in other words. And at those days, if you go back and read those newspapers, you'll see talk about wastage in government, you talk about corruption. There was actually an official government inquiry into corruption in 1955. All these issues are not new.
Right, but it's the scale of it, though. I think that's what's most troubling to people, right? Now, while corruption may have been around for decades or generations, it's the sheer scale of the 1MDB controversy, though. So wouldn't it be fair?
Before we talked about 1MDB, and I was talking about $5 billion, which is 5 billion ringgit, sorry, which is the extent of the government's formal exposure compared to the total economy. That's not even 0.01%. That's not to say that 1MDB, there weren't, corrupt people and that something should be done and people should be jailed. Yes. But that's not, when you're talking about the total economy. Look, give you an example. In April this year, when 1MDB defaulted on a loan to its Middle Eastern people, and there was a dispute there, the international rating agencies did not blink an eye. They did not change their assessment of Malaysia's ability to repay its debts because they knew that that amount of money was very small in the total picture. So I'm talking about the total picture. If you want, there ought to be a book about 1MDB, but that's not my book.
Certainly you can concede that these international rating agencies, right, they are obviously viewing it through a different lens. Right?
They are looking at it from the capacity of the government to repay its obligations, yes.
Right, as opposed to ordinary Malaysians who then look at these policies and see there being tremendous pressure on the cost of living. So, again, what's to say that Najibnomics is really good?
1MDB has nothing to do with the cost of living. I mean, it has nothing to do with the cost of living. It's all about a failed government attempt to promote certain types of economic development. The other point is...
And you describe them as expensive disappointments.
I do, yes. They are. That's clearly they are.
But yet you can still contend that Najibnomics is good, net positive?
In total context, yes. Because these issues are small by comparison to others. I mean, you also often hear people saying, well, this 177 billion figure that I referred to before, what would happen if all of those companies went bankrupt and the government had to pay them? What would happen? Now, 177 billion is roughly equivalent to around 16% of national GDP. Now, the current government has direct debts, loans, equal to around 54% of GDP. You add those two together, all right, and you still have a figure which is considerably lower in terms of GDP than what Malaysia had in 1980. 1990, they had a debt to GDP ratio of 80%, which doesn't include the contingent liabilities, which I just added in. In the 1980s, Malaysia's debt to GDP was well over 100%. When people talk about debt today in Malaysia, they don't have that economic, that historical context. And so they think things are bad.
Yet at the same time, if you take a closer look at those numbers, though, you see some accounting gymnastics, so to speak. For example, the Najib administration has moved some of its debt, housing loans by its civil servants off to a separate entity. So there's a closer scrutiny on the rise in off-budget items.
That's what contingent liabilities are. That's the figures I was giving you before.
On top of that, you got, say, the rise in emoluments, right? Salaries and pensions, etc. for the civil service that is just growing and growing. I have some numbers here. Back in 2010, at least for budget 2010, it was at 42 billion ringgit. Budget 2017, this year, up to over 77 billion ringgit. That's an increase of over 80% in 8 years. How is this sound fiscal policy?
Well, again, you would look at the total picture. We already told you that if you look, you've got to look at the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP. And as a percentage of GDP, it is falling. Okay? So the total picture, not saying, that a certain number has gone up by a certain amount. You have to look at it in the context of how big is the economy now, how much money does government is coming in, and how much is it actually spending.
Let's move on to another policy then. In chapter 4 of your book, you wrote about Najib's efforts to liberalize the Malaysian economy. For example, the Bumiputra stake in companies, allowing for more...
That was some of his early moves, yes.
Right, more foreign ownership of domestic insurance companies. But we are starting to see some of that unravel right now. For example, Bank Negara apparently wants to limit foreign ownership in the insurance space. There reportedly are plans to impose a 30% Bumiputra quota for beef importers. Does that suggest that the Prime Minister's policies, Najibnomics, it's a lot of good intentions lacking in execution?
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, it's certainly... I would say probably true to say that with an election coming up, he's got to be able to modify some aspects of policy in order to please his political base. Yes. But
having to succumb to vested interests, perhaps.
Yeah, I suppose you could put it like that. But I mean, this is a man who put through GST despite the tremendous upsurge in public protest. He went through the Trans-Pacific Partnership thing, again, facing serious protest, although that probably won't work now anyway. He announced the GST before the 2013 election and implemented it after the election, when other governments had considered the same thing and turned them down. Now, he needed that money, all right, to balance his budget. He eliminated fuel subsidies. Again, to tremendous public opposition. Again, because look, before the fuel subsidies, 20% of government expenditure was going on these subsidies. 20%, which meant all that money couldn't be spent on education, it couldn't be spent on health, it couldn't be spent on infrastructure, all right? Now that figure is down to around 10% because there still are some subsidies in progress.
Let's end with this. As I read your book, it seems to me that it was more journalistic in nature rather than something that was a harsher analysis of Najibnomics. In fact, you got MP Ong Kian Meng who wished for a, quote, more critical and comprehensive examination of Najibnomics. How do you respond to that?
Well, if he was to tell me precisely what it was that he didn't like, I could come up with a second edition. I mean, if I was to say, if I regretted anything, it would probably be that I didn't explain in more detail in the book why it was that I thought 1MDB was not going to be discussed in detail. I should have perhaps had a couple more pages in there discussing why it was that 1MDB really, although it's important in a political sense, and maybe in a moral sense, was not as significant in the wider macroeconomic sense. And I would think that perhaps if there was to be a second edition, I would have to address that issue.
And perhaps we can look forward to that being included into your next literary undertaking then, perhaps. Okay. Well, that's all the time that we have. Thank you so much for speaking to us. That was Bruce Gale, author of the book titled Economic Reform in Malaysia, The Contribution of Najibnomics. I'm Tan Chung Han, and this is BFM 89.9.
That episode of BFM Breakfast Grill was brought to you by U Mobile, where data hearts you.